My dear chess friends, this is FIDE Master Victor Neustroev, and in this video I would like to demonstrate how to play with an isolated pawn. This is what you can learn with the example of the game played between two quite strong Soviet chess players. One of them was Lev Polugaevsky, who was several times a winner of USSR championship, and the black player was Anatoly Lutikov, another strong player. The game was played in 1957, but illustrates one of the main concepts of how to play with isolating on d4. So the game started with d4, knight f6, c4, e6, knight f3, c5. Well, e5 you're playing white in this position, I would definitely continue with d5. However, the second popular move is e3. Bishop e7, knight c3, castle, bishop d3 is just a natural development for queen's gambit, and d5. So finally transposed to Tarrasch defense. Castle, d takes c4, bishop takes c4, knight b d7, queen comes to e2, a6 with the idea to play b5 and activate the bishop. That's why a4. C takes d4, well, taken with the knight is possible, but it means that this bishop is a bad bishop. And that's why white decided to capture with the pawn, and this is how we receive a position with an isolated pawn. So here your task is to decide which plan to follow. The plans were already shown in the previous short video. Well, this bishop is required to get improved. The rooks should be coordinated, while black plan is to activate the bishop on c8. So after e takes d4, black decided to play knight b6 with the idea either to exchange their knight for our light squared bishop or to occupy the d5 square, in other words, to block our d4 pawn. Because you know, when black is playing against an isolated pawn, their task is to exchange pieces, of course, but also to block the pawn and later attack it with more pieces. This is how they prevent us from playing d5 at a certain moment of the game. So bishop b3 was played by Lev Polugaevsky. Well, this move makes sense as well, but later in the game you'll realize why bishop d3 isn't a good idea. So bishop b3, of course, we keep this bishop alive, and this move was quite natural. That was probably the best option. However, instead, black decided to solve the problem with their light squared bishop, so they played bishop d7. With bishop d7, they unfortunately blocked the d file, so we may allow ourselves to play knight e5, which is quite a typical move. The knight goes to the center, and this is how we can continue our main plan, a king-side attack. And, well, this pawn is not hanging. This is another important thing. Again, knight bd5 was a better option, after which the game would likely continue with rook d1, knight b4, h4, an attempt for a king-side attack, bishop c6, and then rook c8. Well, in this position, I think black white would capture on c6, b takes c6, but the main disadvantage for our position is that we cannot chase this knight away. So that c6 isn't actually a weakness because it's well protected with the knight that we cannot get rid of. Well, the position would be equal in such a case. What happened instead? Instead, they played bishop e8 in order to secure the bishop as well as to attack the pawn on d4. As the result, we play rook d1, protecting it. Finally, knight blocks on d5. What do you think? What is the next move white should do? How would you continue in this position? If you want, you may pause this video and try to answer this question yourself. Okay. I'm sure you have some suggestions. Definitely exchanging on d5 is a better idea. You only simplify the position, which favors black. With more exchanges, they get more room to maneuver with their pieces. And with fewer pieces on the board, the pawn on d4 becomes weaker. Because it's an isolated pawn, it can be protected only with pieces, while there are no neighboring pawns. So here we may continue with the kingside attack, and in order to succeed with this attack we need more pieces to get involved into this attack. That's why rook d3, with the idea to relocate our rook to g3 and h3. This maneuver is called a rook lift and is also quite common when we play positions with isolated pawn. However, usually it's f4, then rook f3, and then rook g3, rook h3. This time rook d1 was played in order to protect the pawn, and now when this pawn doesn't require any protection, then the rook may move to g3 and h3. Well, the best response for black could be maybe this move, after which we would continue with this, sacrificing the pawn on d4. However, then after bishop h6, they have no better move but g6, and we can capture on f8 anytime we want, ending up with extra exchange for a pawn. Well, a dark-squared bishop is an important piece in this position, that's why I don't want you to hurry and capture on f8 right away. You can do it later when you find the best moment for it. So, unfortunately for black, instead of that, or maybe they just didn't want to lose their exchange, they played rook to c8, rook to g3, with the idea of bishop h6, of course, king h8, and bishop comes to g5. So you see what we are doing. We are trying to develop our non-active pieces. The bishop on c1 wasn't doing anything. And by activating the bishop, we also have in mind the idea to activate this rook. Knight b4, now the pawn is hanging, that's why rook d1 developing the rook as well as protecting the pawn on d4. Rook c7. Well, this is a good prophylaxis, but maybe too slow for this concrete position. The idea is to protect the 7th rank, of course. Okay, rook h3 was played by white, and this is how they pressure the h file, the h7 and probably the king. And then black made a kind of an accuracy. They played this move, g6, weakening their king side. Instead, they'd better continue with bishop c6. Well, taking here doesn't really look like a good option. They can capture with their rook, they can capture with the pawn, but what I don't like is that we exchange this knight, which is quite helpful for our kingside attack. For example, we have a lot of tactical ideas like knight f7 or knight g6, or maybe bishop takes d6, f takes d6, and then knight g6 at a certain moment of the game. Right now, nothing like that works, but it may work in the future. So what do you think? If bishop c6 was played, how would you continue with white pieces? Well, then you can mix your plan with the kingside attack and activate the f pawn in order to play f5 and weaken this diagonal and finally capture on f7. This is where white is slightly better, but I'm sure black has enough defensive resources and the game would continue, and there is no guarantee that the result would be clear. Okay, so g6 was played instead of bishop c6, after which we could reply with f4. Let's go back and follow the game. Queen f3. Well, this is a multifunctional move. Of course, one of the ideas is to pressure the knight, maybe the f7 pawn. The other idea is to somehow bring the queen to h4 and pressure h7 as well. Or maybe at a certain moment of the game, sacrifice the rook and bring the queen to h3. What was played in the game? Black reacted with this move. Well, If, for example, they continued with this, we would play bishop h6. And then the rook is trapped. For example, the game could continue. This, again, I don't think this is a good idea, but this is a possible way to take advantage. White with extra exchange. Instead, queen f4, and then bishop g5. And finally, the queen goes to the h file. For example, rook f8, bishop takes f6, bishop takes f6, and after queen h6, it's time to resign because we take on h7 and none of black pieces may stop us from doing it. So that's why black decided to not play king g8 move, they played rook g8 move. Keeping in mind the idea of protecting the g6 pawn, maybe this rook g7 move as well. Now, what do you think white should do? They have a choice. They have two really good moves that could lead to quite a beneficial position for white. So one of the options is d5. It's quite common when we sacrifice this pawn, but get more opportunities to continue the attack with our pieces. But this time d5 is not even a sacrifice. E takes d5, knight takes d5, knight takes d5, and rook takes d5. And they have to move their queen, and they have to play under the pressure. If, for example, knight takes d5, white wins quickly. What do you think? How white wins in this position? You may pause this video and simply find this two moves combination. 2 or 3 moves combination. Okay, I'm sure you found it. It's rook h7, king takes, and then queen gets to h6 through h3 to h6 with a checkmate. Well, of course, nobody forces black to capture this rook on d5 with their knight. They can probably move the queen away, but their position is already worse, because if they move their queen, f6 knight is hanging. So it's a kind of a tough position, and maybe after d5 here, it was better for them to not take, but they are still in the trouble. White played a different move, which is also strong enough. It's this, knight to e4. Pressuring here. Knight h5 was played. Well, if they take on e4, that would be a huge problem. Of course, now you understand that it's rook h7 and then this maneuver with queen h6. So that's why they actually played knight h5 to stop it. Now, white pieces are concentrated on their king side, and if you know that you have material advantage on a certain side of the board, especially when the king is located, the enemy king is located there as well, you may consider some tactical options and sacrifices. Well, rook h5 looks quite attractive, but then it's not easy to find how to continue. That's why instead white decides to sacrifice the queen on f7. So bishop takes f7, for example, this move wasn't played in the game. Then knight takes f7, king g7, knight takes d8, rook takes d8. Well, and yeah, they have to take, otherwise knight e6. Rook takes d8, g4, the knight is under attack, and if bishop g5, it's knight g5, attacking e6 and attacking the knight as well. So knight f6, bishop h6, king goes there, and after knight g5 they lose this critical pawn on e6 and the game is over. So that's why accepting this sacrifice means to lose the game right away. Black decided to play bishop to c6, however after queen e6 they lose another pawn. Well, here they played rook g7 and the game became completely winning. Well, yeah, they have to cover the f7 square, so for example, in case if they decide to take, it's just knight f7 and knight takes d8. So that's why rook g7. But now it's d5 and the pawn goes to d6 and so on. So bishop e7, rook e7, check, queen d6, check is not possible. Queen e8, knight f6, for example. However, it was good enough. Well, taking here means they take on h3. That's why knight f6 attacking the queen. And if they take with their knight, queen checks, rook g7, and after d6, it's time to resign. This pawn is promoted. Or knight f7 can be played on the next move. So this is a completely winning position. So what we learned about this game. From this game, you learned a typical attacking plan when you have an isolated pawn. Of course, if black would play properly, that wouldn't happen, and the game would be more tough for white. However, it's easy for black to make a mistake because they need to focus on their development. For example, here, bishop d7 looks like a natural move, but at the same time is a kind of a mistake. So it's easy for black to make a mistake, and you should take advantage of this mistake. And also, please keep in mind this idea of a rook lift that was finally implemented by white. So rook d3, rook g3, and then rook h3. Another typical idea is to make this rook lift with f4 pawn as well. So later in the game, f4 finally could be played. For example, in this variation after rook h3, bishop c6, f4 could be played, and if so, white would have to mix several plans. So when you play with isolated pawn, think about typical plans that you have, choose the one you think is best, and if you struggle with this plan, maybe you should just mix it with another plan, and this is how you will succeed. Thank you for your attention. We will continue in the next video with another game example.